Now, the U.S. has seized the Olina tank in the Caribbean, marking the fifth vessel taken in recent weeks as Washington intensifies efforts to curb Venezuelan oil exports. U.S. officials said the tanker was seized on Friday. According to public shipping data from Equasis, the Olina was falsely flying the flag of Timor-Leste. An industry source with direct knowledge said the vessel had previously sailed from Venezuela and later returned to the region. Now, for more, we are joined by Newzroom Africa's correspondent Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. A very good evening to you, Simon. It's only been a week into the new year and there's so much going on already. But let's start first about the vessels that were captured that we just spoke about now in this intro, those vessels that were captured by the U.S. government.
Yeah, so what the United States government is doing, as you know, is they are interdicting Venezuelan oil tankers that are subject to American sanctions. These maritime operations began last month, and they have grown increasingly intense. Today's action comes just a couple of days after the United States armed forces, supported by the British Armed Forces, also seized another tanker, the Bella 1, which actually had fled Venezuelan waters, was pursued into the Atlantic Ocean by American forces, who then for a while appeared to lose track of it because the tanker turned off its transponder, and eventually it was found, having reflagged itself, protected it, thought by a Russian flag, in the waters off Iceland. So this kind of pursuit that went, halfway around the world eventually resulted in the United States taking control of that tanker and now another one today. I mean, all of this is coming at a point where we are almost a week after President Trump's military assault on Venezuela that, of course, led to the capture of now former President Nicolas Maduro. But it hasn't led to regime change in Venezuela. Instead, Maduro's deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, is running things in Caracas, and President Trump insists that he ultimately is now controlling everything in Venezuela because of this very, very tight embargo that he is enforcing on the sanctioned oil tankers and Venezuela's sanctioned oil more broadly. He says that the United States now is going completely to control the Venezuelan oil industry, that all oil from Venezuela will be shipped to the United States and then refined in the United States and sold onwards, and that if the Venezuelan government of Delcy Rodriguez does not bend to his will on this, it's very unclear whether she's actually going to bend as far as he wants to go, then, as he put it earlier in the week in an interview with The Atlantic, she will end up in a worse predicament than Nicolas Maduro. But, it has been an extraordinary week. I mean, this time last week, Nicolas Maduro was in Caracas. He was meeting a Chinese special envoy, receiving a New Year's gift from the Chinese government, with no indication that just a matter of hours later, US forces would drag him out of his bed, drag him to the United States. He's now in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, put him on trial on narco-terrorism charges, but not engage in regime change in Venezuela. Leave the Maduro regime without Maduro in place and try and co-opt it.
And, Simon, as you're speaking about whether the interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, will bend, Trump also posted that he's cancelled the second wave of attacks on Venezuela because the current regime, through Rodriguez, is cooperating with his administration. But also what we saw yesterday, Simon, were 5 Republicans who voted against Trump on Venezuela. Tell us a little bit more about those 5 Republicans voting against more further attacks on Venezuela and what needs to happen should there be more attacks and what this all means.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, those Republicans were shutting the door, the stable door, after the horse had bolted, as is often the case with successive presidents here in the United States. Congress is rarely notified, as is legally required, by the president of the day about military action that the president of the day plans to take. And then they stamp their feet afterwards and say, well, the White House didn't go through the right notification processes. So on this occasion, those 5 Republicans have crossed the aisle to kind of draw a line in the sand and try and somewhat constrain the president's ability, if he wanted to take further military action. Although, once again, I suspect President Trump, and again, this is not uniquely a Trump issue, I think President Trump would launch whatever military action he wanted to launch and worry about Congress later on. I mean, I think the bigger development here over just the last 24 hours is the revelation that in an interview with the New York Times, and it's the front page lead of the Friday edition of the New York Times, President Trump has said, and this is a direct quote, "I don't believe in international law." Trump asserts his global power has one limit, himself, reports the newspaper. And he says, "My own morality, my own mind is the only thing that can stop me." And so for all of those countries around the world that had been sort of waiting to opine on what happened in Venezuela last weekend, while they said they wanted to see the legal justification for President Trump's action, there isn't going to be any legal justification for it. It's plainly illegal. The president himself last weekend said that he had assaulted Venezuelan sovereignty. And here he is in this newspaper today, in this extraordinary interview with the New York Times, saying that he basically wants nothing to do with international law. He doesn't believe in it. He says it's not his intention to hurt people, but he doesn't feel the need in any way to be constrained by either international law or by international treaties. And that sends an absolutely astonishing message to the rest of the world that certainly since the end of World War II, has tried at least publicly to pledge fealty, even if it doesn't always meet the required bar, pledge fealty to the idea of a rules-based international system of law and order. This is an American president absolutely incinerating it.
An astounding admission. And also, Trump, back to the oil as well, claiming that he's getting the oil prices down and going to give money to Venezuela. But we also saw, as you're mentioning, this is not Trump. This is a lot. It's not just him, but there's also a team behind him. And Vice President J.D. Vance also said in an interview, I think this one was with Fox News, that Venezuela would be able to sell its oil only if it served the interests of Washington. Now, what are the other conditions that have been made?
Yeah, well, not just sell its oil, but also what the United States is doing is saying to President Rodriguez that she has to cut her ties, cut Venezuela's ties with Iran, with China, with Russia, and with Cuba. And what we've seen this week from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, the United Nations ambassador from the United States, and also from President Trump himself, is this assertion that the Western Hemisphere, the whole of Latin America, and by the way, they include Greenland in the Western Hemisphere, is uniquely America's sphere of influence. This is our hemisphere, they say. This is where we live, and we are going uniquely to make up the rules for all nations that are positioned in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the Trump administration dictating directly, in this case to Venezuela, a sovereign nation, but also indicating great frustration with Colombia, with Cuba, even with Mexico, dictating to them their own foreign policy and telling them you can't have your own relationship with Iran, with Cuba, with China, or with Russia, because we make the rules in this hemisphere. And that, again, I mean, we're only 9 days into the new year, Masa. That, again, is a stunning move by a very emboldened American president who really, I think at this point, many analysts argue, wants to be seen to be carving up the world alongside Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. And there are tremendous fears in this city among foreign policy analysts about the message that all of this sends with regard to the future of Ukraine, with regards to the future of Taiwan. Is this an American president who simply wants to be one of three big, strong men on the world stage? That certainly appears to be what he's suggesting.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you also mentioned Greenland as well. But before we even get there, he said that American companies are set to take over the oil industry in Venezuela and they're going to get it up and running again. Which companies are these? And have there been any indications of, how much money would need to be pumped?
It's a great question, and he's getting a lot of pushback from the big oil behemoths here in the United States, who, first of all, look at the situation in Venezuela, and if they're going to invest, want to see stability, and they certainly don't see stability there. But secondly, also, they are dubious about this, because if you bring all of that Venezuelan oil onto the world market and rebuild the industry, which desperately needs repair and assistance in Venezuela, that's going to put more oil into the world market, which will depress prices. So big oil is asking President Trump exactly how all of this is going to work. But there's also evidence here to suggest that some of the president's friends and donors, even in one case, a member of his Mar-a-Lago resort down in Florida, much smaller scale kind of wildcatters, as they call them, down in Texas in the oil industry. These privately run smaller oil companies are absolutely chomping at the bit to get into Venezuela. Indeed, there are two that have previously been involved with Venezuela and want to get back in there to start re-establishing business ties that they were forced to sever as a result of sanctions only in May of last year. So there is evidence to suggest that a couple of prominent supporters of President Trump, including one man who has met with President Trump 4 times over the course of the last several months, they may be the people in the US president's ear saying, leave Maduro in place, leave Maduro's regime, rather, in place. Don't engage in this transition to democracy. Let's keep the regime in place because we, these two smaller operators, know how to work the system in Venezuela, and let us get back in there so that we can avail ourselves of the business that we lost last year. So I think that's definitely a factor. And finally, Masa, on the issue of when Venezuela's opposition leaders might be allowed to return to the country, the Trump administration isn't even demanding that. And next week, President Trump is going to be meeting Maria Corina Machado. You will remember she is the Venezuelan opposition leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And she has suggested now, in order to get American support for her just to go back to the country, that she is willing to give her Nobel Peace Prize to Donald Trump. And he actually said on American television last night in an interview with Fox News that he would be honored to accept it from her when she visits him next week at the White House. That is the level of venality that exists here now that is governing this process.
Extraordinary. And now, Simon, just going back to Greenland and Trump wanting to acquire it. I mean, Greenland is worried, Denmark is worried, and the polls show that the majority of the people in Greenland want independence. Last polling, I believe, shows about 6% who wanted US control. Why does President Donald Trump want Greenland?
It's very hard to answer that question because the arguments that the president puts up for taking control of Greenland do not stand up to scrutiny. He says America needs Greenland for its national security, which is a bit of a blanket claim. But then he goes on to say that the waters of Greenland are regularly being patrolled by Russian and Chinese vessels, and that's why America really needs to beef up its presence there to see off any threat from Russia and China to engage in their own territorial expansion and go after Greenland's resources and its minerals. Now, if you talk to Greenlanders, and I was listening to one interview earlier this week with a former correspondent with Greenlandic Broadcasting, they say there are hardly ever see any Russian or Chinese vessels in the waters off Greenland. And so they have no understanding of where this claim is coming from. Also, the Danes point out that under existing agreements, if President Trump wants to send more troops to Greenland, there's a small military base there, he could absolutely expand that dramatically. And the Danes say that they're open to any kind of negotiation and discussion with the United States, short of ceding Greenland's sovereignty and their territorial administration of Greenland to the United States. But this is an American president that wants to expand America's territorial footprint, whether it's Greenland, whether it's getting Canada to become America's 51st state. We know he wants to plant the stars and stripes in Gaza. For him, territorial expansion and, of course, getting his hands on those valuable minerals that are believed to lie beneath Greenland soil, that is the driver here. And it's going to become, in the next week, a big problem again, because Secretary of State Marco Rubio is going to be meeting with his Danish counterpart, and the Danes insist Greenland is not for sale.
Yeah, I think there was a mention of not military invasion, but possibly selling it. But, you know, Denmark has made it very clear that Greenland isn't for sale. In fact, the Danish Prime Minister says a Greenland takeover would mean the end of NATO. Quite a heavy warning.
Yeah, a massive warning. And look, these threats to Greenland are causing consternation among European leaders because they seriously worry, that particularly if there was any effort militarily by the United States to seize Greenland, that would completely destroy NATO. And this week, the White House, in an official statement, said the military option is one of several options that are being considered by President Trump with regard to taking control of Greenland. But absolutely, Denmark is a key NATO ally of the United States. Other European leaders have been holding crisis talks to try and determine how to push back against this. We've seen the French come out, the British come out and say, absolutely, there are no circumstances under which they believe that Denmark and Greenland should be severed from one another, and there is no conversation to be had about future ownership of the territory. But the White House is not giving this up, and having gone after Venezuela last weekend, as the New York Times reports as resulting from this interview today, they say they found in that interview that President Trump was more emboldened about his capacity to act and his use of American power than at any point during 2025. And we're only a week into 2026.
Only a week. It feels like a lifetime already in this 1 week. And before I let you go, Simon, I want to just bring it back to U.S. domestic issues as well. This week, we saw the tragic, fatal shooting of a 37-year-old woman, Renee Good, in Minneapolis. And following that, by an ICE agent, and following that, there have been heavy protests as well in certain parts of the U.S. as well. What's the atmosphere like now? And would you say that the killing of Renee Good by an ICE agent is the beginning of some sort of a turning point?
Look, I think it's amazing that it didn't happen before, because the brutality of ICE, Donald Trump's masked thugs taking to the streets all over this country and sweeping people up in the president's mass deportation more, has been unrestrained for several months now. It was always inevitable that someone was going to get killed. And the more we learn about what took place yesterday, and just within the last hour, there is some fresh video that is circulating on social media. The less the administration's telling of what happened yesterday and the full-throated backing of ICE is justified. It is absolutely clear that in the 7 seconds that elapsed between Renee Good being told to get out of her car by 3 ICE agents and the fatal shot that killed her, she was doing nothing other than planning to get out of the way on the roadway where her vehicle was parked. Indeed, it looks increasingly likely from every piece of video that we're seeing that she was preparing to do a U-turn and leave the scene. There was absolutely no reason at all for her to be shot dead by that ICE agent yesterday, but the administration here is calling her a professional agitator. They say she was a domestic terrorist. They say she was part of a dark underground network of radical leftists planning, conspiring against the Trump administration. There is no evidence to support any of those claims. And now the concern is that the investigation into the killing is going to be a cover-up because only the FBI is going to be conducting it. And there's no way, given what we've heard from administration officials about what a hero this ICE agent who fired that kill shot there's no way he's going to be facing criminal charges in connection to Ms. Good's killing. And I think that the message that's going out from the White House to the United States is that these masked thugs, because that's what they are, of the American government, have total license, a completely green light, and total impunity for anything they want to do on the streets of this country. And that's creating, as you can imagine, a very brittle and concerning atmosphere here.
Simon, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really, really appreciate it. Important conversations we're having right there. We'll be in touch, of course, as that story continues to develop as well.